Hello everyone, welcome aboard. So again, we are back with the next lecture of the ongoing polity series. And today we are going to discuss the salient features of our constitution. So in the last two lectures, we have discussed about the evolution of Indian constitution and the making up of Indian constitution. So let's get started and discuss what are some of the salient features of Indian constitution. First and foremost, this is the lengthiest written constitution of the world. So there can be two types of constitution, one which is written like USA, India, and non-written, like which goes on with the traditions and conventions, as is the case with Britain. So Indian constitution is the lengthiest written constitution. So originally it contained 395 articles which were divided into 22 parts, and it was having 8 schedules. What are the schedules? Schedules are like the appendix tables at the end of the constitution. Okay, we'll discuss it in the upcoming chapters. As of now, so in the last 70 years, it has gone through several amendments. A lot of situations has been changed in the country, as a result of which we have modified the constitution as per our needs. So now it contains around 465 articles. Why I'm saying around? Because there might be plus minus 2 or 3, plus which are divided into 25 parts now. Earlier it was having 22 parts, and now it is having 12 schedules. Earlier it was having 8 schedules. Okay, what are some of the reasons which has contributed to this bulky volume of the Indian constitution? First of which is the geographical factors. So India is a very diverse country. There are a lot of cultures, language, people who live in different areas. So in order to accommodate the demands of which, various detailed arrangements have been made, okay, which has contributed to the bulky volume of the constitution. Then historical factors. The structural part of our constitution comes from Government of India Act 1935. Okay, and this itself was very heavy and bulky in nature, and which has also contributed to the increased volume of our constitution. Then another important factor which has contributed to the bulkiness is the single constitution for states as well as central. So if you take, for example, the United States, there are two levels of the government as we have in India, which is known as federalism. So there is a separate constitution in the United States, one for the central government and another one for the state government. But in India, we have a single constitution, which is source of the power for both union as well as state government. Okay. Then another factor which has contributed to the increased volume is dominance of lawyers in our constituent assembly. So if you see a lot of prominent personalities of India by that time, Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, Motilal Nehru, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, Dr. Rajendra Prasad, if you take B.R. Ambedkar, any people who have contributed to the making up of the constitution, most of them were lawyers, and that's why they have discussed the legal provisions in very much detail, and it has also contributed to the bulkiness of the constitution. Now, let's move to the second feature of our constitution. It has been drawn from various sources. Actually, some people have to say that it has been created after studying every available constitution of the world. Okay, a lot of criticism has came as which has called it a patchwork, but there's nothing new which you can create. Okay, once the same thing has been done by lot many people. So even though if it has been done after studying various constitutions of the world, it is a good thing we have customized those constitutions as per our need, and then only we have adopted it. So one very traditional question which comes from this area is the different sources of the constitution. So structural part of the constitution comes from Government of India Act 1935. Preamble has been taken from the US Constitution. Same goes for the fundamental right. Directive principle of state policy has been taken from Irish Constitution. Fundamental duties which were not present in the original constitution has been added by 42nd Amendment Act. They have been taken from Russia. The system of the parliamentary government has been taken from Britain. But guys, this is not it. Lakshmikant, as we have discussed, as our resource for this polity subject. So there in this chapter of salient features of our constitution, at the end of the chapter, there is a table which talks about the sources of the constitution in detail. So today, after finishing this lecture, I recommend all of you to go through that list and table and try to by heart all the sources of the constitution. Moving ahead. The next feature of our constitution is a blend of rigidity and flexibility. So which constitution can be called as a rigid versus which constitution can be called as flexible? First, we need to understand this. So a rigid constitution will be a constitution which cannot be amended, or in simple terms changed very easily, or when there is too much difficulty to change a constitution, it is called as rigid. And when it is too much easy to change a constitution, then it is called as flexible. So Constitution of India is a blend of rigidity as well as flexibility at the same time. Why? Because the constitution can be amended, almost half of the constitution can be amended as per Article 368, which makes it very rigid, because for this change it needs a special majority in both the houses of the parliament, meaning Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha. And for even some of these changes or amendment, it needs first special majority in both the houses, plus the amendment has to be supported by at least half of the state legislatures, so which makes it very tough to change. Whereas there is a lot of simple changes which can be made outside the Article 368, where this article simply doesn't apply. For example, if we want to, Parliament want to create a new state, so it doesn't has to amend the constitution as per Article 368. It can simply create a new state by a simple amendment, which will not need any type of special majority or the ratification by half of the states. So this makes it a lot of part of the constitution very flexible, and that is why our constitution has been called a blend of rigidity and flexibility. Moving ahead. Our constitution also provides a federal system with unitary bias. So what is a federal system? Federal system simply refers to the two levels of the government. Okay, there are a lot of other features which makes it truly federal, and there is an entire chapter on the Indian federalism. That's why I'm not focusing too much on the characteristics of the federal system. But it is not completely federal, means the two levels of the government, means central and state government, they are biased more towards the central government. Okay, and a lot of people have called this with a different name, and that's what I have mentioned. A lot of times we have seen this type of questions have been asked in prelims, where they will simply ask who has called it quasi-federal, then answer will be KC where. Who has called the Indian constitution or Indian federalism as bargaining federalism? It has been called so by Morris Jones. Granville Austin has called it cooperative federalism, and Ivor Jennings has called it federation with a centralizing tendency. Okay, so it's not completely federal in its spirit. Our constitution is adopting a federal system with a unitary bias. Moving ahead, our constitution has opted for the parliamentary form of the government. So in the modern democratic system, any country or society usually opts for either parliamentary or presidential form of the government. Presidential form of the government, example, what the United States have, parliamentary form of the government, what Britain or India has opted for. So there are some features how you identify that there is a parliamentary form of the government in the country. This is presence of nominal and real executive. For example, nominal executive in whose name all the actions are taken, but the real power lies with somebody else. So in India, this is the case with the president and prime minister. Then majority party rule, collective responsibility of the council of minister or the executive to the legislature, membership of the ministers in the legislature itself, leadership of the prime minister, and dissolution of the lower house. If you take the presidential system, for example, there is no dissolution of the lower house. There are separate elections. Actually, the American president is not even the member in the legislature. He doesn't have any collective responsibility in the legislature. And any of the American majority party like Republican or the Democrats can have majority and somebody else can be president. That is also possible. And there is a single executive in the presidential system of the government. So if you are not able to absorb the federal system or federal features and parliamentary form of the government, please do not worry. There are separate chapters which will be discussed on these two topics. Moving ahead, Parliament versus judicial supremacy. So actually there are three organs of the government, as we all know: legislature, executive, and the judiciary. Executive has almost all the executive powers. So mostly all the modern countries have given more power to either legislature or judiciary in order to create a balance in the society. So for example, the British system has given supremacy to parliament. So the British parliament is the sovereign body, or it has the highest authority in the British system, whereas American system has gone for the judicial supremacy, or their judiciary is the strongest among all the three organs. The reason behind this is because American has opted for something called due process of law. We'll discuss these concepts in detail later. Indian has discussed, they have opted for something called procedure established by law. Okay, and India has gone for a synthesis of British and American system. So let's see how. So let us say there is some action which has been taken by the executive. Legislature can pass any law denying that action or stopping executive from doing that action. But in no way in Britain, British court can declare a law null and void which has been created by the British Parliament. Whereas in US, no matter what law has been created by the US Congress, judiciary can declare it null and void, and its decision is going to be final. Okay, that's what is known as due process of law. India has opted for something called procedure established by law. Means once the parliament has created a law, then judiciary can just go for the interpretation of that law. Judiciary cannot change it or reject the law itself, whereas American judiciary can reject any law if it is not following the American spirit of due process of law. Okay, so in India, we have not made judiciary or legislature, either of them, as supreme. Rather than that, we have created a synthesis of parliament versus parliamentary and judicial supremacy. How? If it comes to certain basic features like fundamental rights or directive principle of the state policy, we have provided the power of judicial review to Indian judiciary, which as per Article 13 can declare any law made by the parliament as null and void if it is against the fundamental rights. At the same time, it has empowered the Parliament of India, which can amend the majority portion of the constitution. Okay, so here is the doctrine of checks and balances rather than making any single organ of the state as supreme. Let's move ahead. Integrated and independent judiciary. So by integrated judiciary means we have a system of courts where Supreme Court stands at the top, and same hierarchy of courts is implementing central and as well as state laws. For example, if you go to US, there they have a separate system of courts for federal laws, and there is a separate system of court for state laws. Also, judiciary, in order to become very independent, a lot of arrangements are needed, like security of tenure or fixed security of tenure, or security of their expenses. All these arrangements have been made in the constitution itself in order to ensure the independence of Indian judiciary. Moving ahead. Fundamental rights, which are very significant feature of our constitution. These are mentioned in the part 3 of the constitution, and they have been opted from United States Constitution. They are there to promote the idea of the political democracy, means they give everybody equal power. They also acts as a limitations on the legislature and executive, because if legislature or executive does anything which is against the provisions of the fundamental right, then Indian judiciary, as we saw in the last slide, has the power of judicial review as per Article 13, and it can declare those acts as null and void. The fundamental rights are justifiable in nature, means in case they are being encroached upon or taken away by legislature or executive, we can go to the court and they will help us to restore these rights. Another thing is about the fundamental right is they are not absolute but qualified, means they are subject to reasonable restrictions. For example, public health as of now has caused or has enabled our parliament to put a restriction on our movement or freedom of movement, which is again part of fundamental right. But as of now, you cannot move out in the season of lockdown. Okay, so all the fundamental rights are subject to reasonable restrictions. They can be curtailed or repealed by the parliament by a suitable amendment, and they can also get suspended during emergency. So here today's question for your homework. Please tell me in the comment section that which of the fundamental rights are not suspended during emergency. Okay. Let's find out where is the fundamental right, then move ahead. Parliamentary form of the government, parliament and judiciary, integrated and independent judiciary, fundamental rights. Next feature of our constitution is directive principle of state policy, which has been taken from the Irish constitution. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar has called it novel features of the constitution. This itself can be a question. Then, as the fundamental rights are meant to promote the idea of political democracy, similarly, directive principle of state policy are meant for promoting the idea of social and economic democracy. They seek to establish a welfare state. There is a welfare state is a state which tries to protect the weakest section of its population. That is known as a welfare state, and this part of our constitution declares India to be a welfare state. This part of the constitution, part 4, which is known as DPSP, is non-justifiable in nature, means in case government is not able to follow or is not following the provisions of this part of the constitution, we cannot move to the court and they cannot be enforced. Okay, whereas we saw the case of fundamental rights is in case of its violation, we have the right to move to the court, and that's why they are known as justiciable. But the DPSP is fundamental in governance. There was a something similar instrument of instruction in Government of India Act 1935. So they actually act as a guiding light for the executive as well as the legislature. And the force behind this part of the constitution is more of moral force or political force. rather than the legal force. Next important segment of our constitution is fundamental duties, which were not present in the original constitution. They have been added by 42nd Amendment Act, and a new part 4A, has been added to the constitution. They were added on the recommendation of Sardar Swarn Singh Committee. There are total 11 duties. Originally there were 10, but 86th Amendment Act has added the 11th duty. They remind us that while enjoying the rights, we must also perform certain duties. Again, like the DPSP, these fundamental duties are non-justifiable in nature. If you are violating these fundamental duties, then nobody can go to the court and you cannot be punished for that. But Parliament has the power to create separate legislation in order to enforce the fundamental duty. For example, for honoring the national flag, the National Flag Act has been enacted by the Parliament, which can provide for the punishment in case of its abrogation. Moving ahead. Constitution of India has also made it a secular state. So in the original constitution, the word secular itself was not mentioned, but this has been added into the preamble by 42nd Amendment. What do we mean by a secular state? Secular state means the state does not have any official religion. For example, Pakistan has official religion as Islam. So it is not a secular state, but a theocratic state. Also, this secularism has not just become a feature only after 42nd Amendment. Since the beginning of the Constitution, there are fundamental rights like Article 14, which talks about right to equality, or Article 15 or 16, which prohibits any kind of discrimination on the basis of religion. Then the fundamental right itself provides a right to religious freedom as per Article 25, 26, 27, and 28. Directive Principle of State Policies, Article 44, also talks about a uniform civil code, means similar set of civil laws for all religious communities, although it has not been implemented. Then this version of Indian secularism is a little bit different from Western secularism. Let's see how. So Western idea of the secularism is about separation between religion and state. Means, imagine if in USA church goes on doing something, then government cannot come and intervene. Whereas in India, the religion has controlled a lot of portions of our lives. So that's why, rather than going for complete separation of religion from the state, the Indian Constitution has opted for a new variant of secularism, which talks about the equal respect and protection of all the religions. Whereas Western idea of the secularism is complete separation of religion and state. So see the difference here. If, for example, in India, somebody says that as per Manu Smriti, or you have recently seen an example that women were not allowed into a particular temple or in a particular religion, some women could have been divorced easily, I would say. Then the state keeps its right to intervene in such matters where the justice can prevail and government can intervene in the religious matter. That's which makes it different from the Western idea of secularism, which talks about complete separation of the religion from state, and there the state will not even intervene in any religious matters. Now, with this idea of secularism, let's move ahead. Government of India Act 1919. Okay, my mistake. This shouldn't have been here. Okay, universal adult franchisee. That is another feature of our constitution. So I just mentioned here why it is unique for our constitution. Universal adult franchisee stands for giving voting rights to all the people above a certain age. So in the beginning, any person in India attained the age of 21 years was allowed to vote. By 61st Amendment Act, we have reduced this voting age to 18 years. And why it is a significant feature, if you see, US has gave franchisee to women to vote in 1920, Britain has given it in 1928, Russia in 1936, France in 1945, and Switzerland has given voting rights to women in 1971. If you talk about, let's say, Africans in the USA, they even got the voting rights after the Second World War. So India, although got independence in 1947, with the enactment of its constitution on 26th January 1950 itself, we went for universal adult franchisee and provided voting rights to all our citizens. Moving ahead. Some other significant provisions, single citizenship as we have opted. So if you take any federal country like United States, there is a provision of dual citizenship. So there, let's say if you live in a state called North Carolina, so you are a US citizen as well as you have a citizenship of North Carolina. Whereas in India, let us say we are living in any Indian state, Uttar Pradesh, Karnataka, Rajasthan, anywhere. So we are just an Indian citizen. There is no state citizenship. Then Constitution also has created a lot of independent bodies which are bulwark of democracy, like Election Commission, UPSC itself, Finance Commission. Okay. Then our Constitution has emergency provisions in order to deal with some emergency situations. Okay, this is not a very modern provisions, but still we have it in order to deal with the crisis situation. Also, we have moved beyond the federal structure. Now we have added another third level of the government into our constitution by 73rd and 74th Amendment Act. So now our governmental structure has become 3-tier instead of 2 tiers. So these were some of the significant provisions of the Constitution. Please go through this list of do's and don'ts and try to follow it in order to maximize your chances for selection. Stay tuned. Please do not forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. We will be back again soon with the next lecture of this series. Thank you all for joining.